Namaskar, Annyeong Hasamnika. I'm truly delighted to welcome you all from Seoul, Republic of Korea. This is Sonu Trivedi, Director of the Swami Vivekanand Cultural Center at Embassy of India in Seoul, with you all today at this session of the third online academic workshop on India at 75, a truly masterclass, I must say, organized in collaboration with the India Center at Busan University of Foreign Studies. I'm especially delighted to share that Swami Vivekanand Cultural Center at the Embassy of India in Seoul has been a pioneer, in fact, a first in starting this truly intellectual enterprise. We organized the very first online workshop on Facets of Modern India in September 2020, exactly 2 years ago. The second edition of the workshop on Facets of India Republic of Korea Partnership was organized from 1st to 14th of September last year by inviting top class, best and brightest minds from India and Republic of Korea on issues of contemporary relevance for both countries. Friends, at the Cultural Center, we have always endeavored to bring the diverse cultural canvas of India at your doorsteps, wherever you are in the world, keeping up with its mission of promoting the cultural and educational cooperation and building upon people-to-people ties between the two countries of India and Republic of Korea. Today, we are before you to bring rich and nuanced understanding of modern India at this truly international forum, especially when India is celebrating 75 years of its independence from centuries of colonial rule. At this juncture, it becomes crucial to introspect its journey of nation building and democratic consolidation in the last 7 decades. With this theme in view, the inaugural lecture of the workshop was organized on Transforming India, Achievements at 75 by Dr. Ram Madhav, who's member of Governing Council, India Foundation. This was organized on August 27th. Besides focusing on modern India in its diverse manifestations, its cultural diversity, progressive history, significant landmarks and achievements by its people in the last 7 decades, the workshop will also highlight upon some of the emerging issues in India and Republic of Korea partnership. Friends, we have an excellent panel lined up for full 1 week, all experts in their own domain to discuss about India at 75 and also emerging issues in India Republic of Korea partnership. It's a pleasure for me to welcome all the participants, scholars and students from India and Republic of Korea, and also there are some students from other countries also who are participating live today. Let me also make some important announcements before we formally begin. Friends, for asking questions, you may write them in chat box or raise your hands virtually through participant window. If time permits, we will take your questions to be answered by the guest speaker. Attendance link for the participants will be shared 10 minutes before the session ends. Certificate of participation will be given only to those who attend all the sessions. We are also live streaming the session and request you to share the link on your timeline for any future point of reference. And I also request you all to follow our social media handles for more updates about our future events, which is @ICC Seoul. Without much ado, let us begin with the proceedings, which will be followed by open house discussion and live interaction with the participants. I'm extremely pleased to have amongst us today Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, who is Dean of School of International Studies and Professor in Chinese Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, along with the presence of Sri Surinder Bhagat, Charge Day Affairs at Embassy of India, Seoul. With these words, let me call upon Sri Surinder Bhagat ji for his welcome remarks.
Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, Dean School of International Studies, Professor Chinese Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, Professor Sunchun Lee, my good friend, Honorary Director, India Center, Busan, and Professor Indian Economics at Busan University of Foreign Studies, Dr. Sonu Trivedi, Director, Cultural Center, distinguished guests, students, researchers, and friends joining us online today. Annyeong Hasamnika, Namaste, good evening to you all. I'm very happy to welcome you all to this third edition of academic workshop on India at 75. We are proud to have the recently established India Center at Busan University of Foreign Studies as our partner for this workshop. We hope that the center will act as a nodal point for India-related events and activities in Busan and serve as a ready resource for India-related events and activities in Busan. Friends, in the course of the next 1 week, a host of globally renowned experts from India and ROK will speak on diverse themes related to foreign policy, economic diplomacy, global media and politics, ESG, smart cities, and strategies for transforming and rebuilding India at 75. These interactive sessions with the participation of Korean and Indian experts will foster better understandings about the nuances of various issues of bilateral, regional, and global interest, and explore new areas of cooperation between the two countries. The timing of the workshop is also important as it is being organized at a juncture when India is celebrating 75 years of its independence, and we are standing at the threshold of commemorating 50th anniversary of establishment of diplomatic ties between India and ROK. Friends, in today's session, we will discuss about an important issue, that is strategic autonomy and geopolitics, opportunities for India and ROK. Given the shift in the center of gravity of global politics from transatlantic to Indo-Pacific and geo-economic realities in the post-pandemic world, cooperation between like-minded countries like India and ROK have acquired a renewed salience. Amidst the rising tensions between global economic powers, crisis in Europe, fears of global recession, continued sense of insecurity and instability in Korean Peninsula, it is pertinent for India, Indo-Pacific countries to understand the opportunities and challenges offered by these shifting geopolitical realities and chart out its own path in this multipolar world, focusing on strategic autonomy and long-term interests. The government of India and Korea have developed a strong, multifaceted partnership encompassing diverse areas like political, commerce, investment, culture, defense, security, advanced technologies, supply chains. Given the complementarities in the foreign policy outlook of our two countries, as reflected in ROK's New Southern Policy and India's Act East policy, the coordination and collaboration between two countries is important for further deepening and strengthening our special strategic partnership. ROK President Yoon envisions South Korea as a global pivotal state, and India is an important country in the Indo-Pacific. They both share common global values of democracy, rule of law, freedom of navigation, respect for sovereignty, market economy. Prime Minister Modi considers Korea as a valuable partner in India's economic transformation. And therefore, there's a lot of convergence between the two sides as far as their vision and foreign policy outlook is concerned. Strategic autonomy and geopolitics, opportunity for India and ROK is a theme on which our esteemed speaker for today's session will deliberate upon. In this session, we are extremely privileged to have Professor Kondapalli amongst us, who will not only reflect upon the topic, but also offer new insights on this important issue. Professor has generously agreed to take few questions also at the end of his lecture. So I will urge all of you to make the most of this session, ask as many questions as you want, and clarify your doubts. In conclusion, I would like to thank India Center at Busan University of Foreign Studies for agreeing to partner with us and bringing together students and researchers from their prestigious university in this workshop. I look forward to an intellectually stimulating session and discussions ahead, and personally engaging with many of you at this interactive forum in the course of next 1 week. Thank you all. Kamsahamnida.
Thank you for your remarks and initiating the discussion. We now move over to the special lecture by Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, who is Dean of School of International Studies and Professor in Chinese Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Formerly, Professor Kondapalli was also Chairman of the Center for East Asian Studies at SIS JNU. Educated in Chinese Studies in India and China, the PhD in Chinese Studies, Professor Kondapalli learned Chinese language at Beijing Language and Culture University and was a postdoctoral visiting fellow at People's University, Beijing. He was also a visiting professor at National Chengchi University, Taipei, a visiting fellow at China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, Beijing, and honorary professor at Shandong University, Jinan, and Jilin University, Changchun, and at Yunnan University of Finance and Economics, Kunming. A non-resident senior fellow at People's University, and also a fellow at Salzburg Global Seminar in 2010. He has written books, monographs, and a number of articles in journals and edited volumes, all on China, and supervised over 30 PhD researchers at JNU, and is also an academic advisor for PhD researchers at Al-Farabi Kazakh National University and Ablai Khan University at Almaty, and also Tamkang University at Taipei. Professor Kondapalli received the K. Subramaniam Award in 2010 for excellence in research in strategic and security studies. Professor Kondapalli is also guest faculty at Indian Armed Forces units, including at the National Defense College, Army War College, College of Air Warfare, College of Naval Warfare, and College of Defense Management, along with distinguished fellow at several think tanks, including Vivekananda International Foundation and Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. And also he's the editor of the journal, which is published by School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is being published by SAGE. Professor Kondapalli, it is a personal pleasure and delight to have you here with us. We look forward to your insights on strategic autonomy and geopolitical opportunities for India and Republic of Korea. Virtual floor is all yours.
Namaskar. Thank you very much for the Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center in Seoul. Let me also thank the Republic of India Embassy in Seoul and Ambassador Bhagat, Dr. Sonu Trivedi, Professor Lee from the Busan University of Foreign Studies. A very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for joining for this interaction on strategic autonomy and geopolitics. When we look at the opportunities for India and Republic of Korea. So I have a few slides. I hope you can see this. So the idea here is to look at the aspects of strategic autonomy and interactions with geopolitical interventions and what could be the opportunities for India and South Korea in this regard. So let me begin by saying that there are several historical aspects for this. Of course, India and South Korea have their own priorities, which need to be factored in when we discuss the strategic autonomy and geopolitics. Geopolitics is a constant feature which the national leaders have to factor in. And of course, they also have their own ideas, subjective ideas of how to run the foreign policy. To start with India, so we have India as a civilizational state. It has a certain autonomy in the cultural sphere, despite various invasions and others. It has had a unified culture that is very significant over a period of centuries. In fact, nearly 20 to 30 centuries that we see the unity in culture in many regions of India. The second is the geographical entity, the Indian subcontinent. Today, of course, with the colonial intervention, the Indian subcontinent is divided into various political segments. Nevertheless, the idea of a pan-Indian subcontinent still exists in the whole region. As you all know, India today has 1.3 billion people, and it is over 3 million square kilometers in territory, and currently the 5th largest economy in the world. And so this is very important for us to understand the autonomy that India exercises. Its priorities include, number one, protecting its sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is a very focused area of attention by the Indian government. And hence, sometimes it is in conflict with some neighboring countries like Pakistan and China. And this is a factor which influences the geopolitics on the kind of foreign policy that India wants to pursue. The second priority is India wants to maintain its freedom of judgment and action in terms of the pursuing its national interests and also, of course, multipolarity. When you look at the recent statement by Dr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, 3 days ago, he was mentioning about multipolarity across the globe and multipolarity in Asia. This is very significant for both India and South Korea in terms of having a concert of powers in Asia rather than being dominated by a single power, so that they can maintain a freedom of judgment and action in their foreign policy goals. A third major priority in India is to work for a more equitable world order, and that is where India's intervention in World Trade Organization or climate change proposals or other broader aspects can be seen from this perspective of working for a more equitable world order. So this has been a major thrust in India's foreign policy, be it in the 1950s when India adopted the non-aligned movement, or even currently when India is emphasizing on strategic autonomy and others. A fourth priority for India is in terms of counter-terrorism. India has identified cross-border terrorism as its #1 national security challenge. This is pertaining to the Jammu and Kashmir region, as well as in the northeast region of India, where we see a lot of insurgency activities promoted by some neighboring countries. So this is one of the major priorities that India has. Finally, in terms of priorities, there is also promoting democracy. For example, since 2001, the Indian Foreign Ministry has been mentioning about promoting democracy as an element in its foreign policy. However, it was confined to South Asia in the last 20 years. But in the past 5-6 years, Prime Minister Modi has been suggesting to promoting democracy abroad. And as a result of this, Indian contribution to the Democracy Fund at the United Nations has increased substantially. This is an area that is important for the ideological aspects of India's foreign policy. Then in terms of the specific aspects of foreign policy, Act East, neighborhood policy, neighborhood first policy, Indian Ocean region diplomacy are also priorities in terms of implementing these aspects in India. And as you all know, Prime Minister Modi won the elections in 2014 with the slogan of Vikas, and roughly translated into English, this means development that is focused on economy. And hence, there is the target of $5 trillion GDP by 2025 in the next 3 years. And you may be knowing that the last month, India had become the 5th largest economy, but most important, it also had a 13.5% growth rate in June. And this year, we expect the growth rates in India to clock around 8% in terms of the year-to-year GDP growth rate. When we look around other countries, this growth rate is quite spectacular, and we expect India to also become a $32 trillion economy by 2040-2050 period. So this is a focal area for Indian foreign policy as well. Other aspects include inclusive development, aspiration to become a member of the United Nations Security Council with a permanent seat and veto power. Of course, it is facing main challenges from Pakistan and China at this moment. If we also have to summarize on the South Korean foreign policy priorities, South Korea has been historically autonomous. And while it abided by a Confucius world order, there are also some jarring notes in relation to the Koguryo Kingdom, which existed in the northern parts of the Korean Peninsula in the 2nd, 3rd century BCs. And there is an urge among the Korean population to own up to this Koguryo Kingdom achievements in the ancient times. There is also the anti-colonial feelings, which are quite strong in the Korean Peninsula and specifically in South Korea. There is also, in the past few years, a certain anti-Japanese opinion. This is in the post-Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1894-95. That has resulted in some differences between South Korea and Japan. But most important is that the Korean people enjoy cultural autonomy, which is sometimes translated into Korean strategic autonomy ideas. When we look at the big business chaebol influence, we see that there is the spectacular growth of these big businesses in South Korea. And despite not having many resources, despite other economic problems, Korea has been able to maintain very high GDP growth rates even today. It has a very high per capita income as well that India wants to learn from. Then there is also Korean nationalism feeds into the strategic autonomy debate once in a while in following the Korean foreign policy. But Korea is concerned with the rise of China. And of course, it is a military alliance partner with the United States. And also the relations with Japan sometimes get animated. So South Korea has to factor in China, US, Japan quite frequently as part of its priorities in foreign policy. Then there is also the constant debate within South Korean political spectrum on how far the alliance with the US be resurrected and how far protecting South Korean autonomy should be emphasized. This became quite important when the Asian financial crisis affected the South Korean economy in 1997. And it also has an impact since the 2008 global financial crisis, as well as the current disruption in supply chain management during the COVID-19 pandemic spread across the globe and including in South Korea. So the autonomy debate is quite eternal in the South Korean political spectrum and reflected in its foreign policy practices. The main challenges that South Korea faces is obviously on economy, how to maintain the lead in this process as 10th largest economy in the world, as well as how to maintain those high per capita income indicators. The second main challenge, of course, South Korea faces is North Korea, from where there is the military threat that has not yet been withdrawn, despite the Sunshine Policy and other CBMs, confidence building measures that South Korea experimented with in the past 2 to 3 decades. There is also the challenge from Japan in terms of maintaining the lead over the economy and semiconductors and others. So essentially, let me just summarize this autonomy debate in South Korea by suggesting the previous President Moon Jae-in's 2017 new Southern policy, which focused mainly on Southeast Asia and India, and the new Northern policy of having CBMs and other agreements with North Korea since 2017. The new government, of course, would be picking up some of the positives of this new Southern policy that was followed in the past 4-5 years. So in that context, let me look at the dynamics in India and South Korea in these 2 columns here. In the past 75 years of Indian independence and practice of foreign policy, we have seen the non-aligned movement, the Bandung Conference in Indonesia in 1955, the advocacy of Afro-Asian unity in the Bandung Conference have shaped the Indian foreign policy dynamics. India is member of the United Nations since the beginning, and the WTO as the founding member of the GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and Tariffs, which became the WTO subsequently. Also, it is a member of the East Asian Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, G20. I'm highlighting this because there is a lot of coordination between India and South Korea in all these multilateral fora, in which South Korea is also a member since 1991 and subsequently. Of course, the Indian strategic autonomy was affected with the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Amity and Friendship that was signed in 1971. However, primarily India, because of the geopolitical condition that it existed when Pakistan, China, United States had a understanding after Henry Kissinger's visit to China and President Nixon's visit subsequent to Beijing, the Indian side has no other choice but to go along with the Soviet Union. In terms of the arms procurement from the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union. However, when the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan, Indira Gandhi crafted the strategic autonomy policy quickly by talking to Pakistan, to China, to various other countries since then. So the strategic autonomy bounced back in Indian foreign policy again when the Soviet Union disintegrated in 91, and the negotiations with the United States on the 123 Civil Nuclear Agreement was signed in 2005-06. So as a part of this package with the United States, India today has several foundational agreements like the LEMOA, which is basically Logistics Maintenance Agreements Act, BECA in terms of the communications, and SISMOA as well. These are foundational agreements in order to move towards a kind of security partnership. However, you may have seen that during the third Quad meeting, the Indian side suggested to, or rather rejected the American pressure to involve in the Ukrainian crisis, and India suggested to Ukraine being a continental aspect while the Quad looking at the maritime aspects. So thereby, India once again stresses its strategic autonomy in this changing geopolitical context. Of course, this is under much stress recently after the Russian invasion of Ukraine since February 24th this year. So the autonomy that India professes is also under a lot of tension with the growing disruptions all across that we see as a fallout of the Ukrainian crisis. How is South Korea faring? South Korea had a problem initially in its inception with the Civil War and the Korean War that erupted between 1950 to 51. 5 campaigns during this has resulted in the United States nudging the United Nations and a conglomeration of countries to help South Korea to counter North Korea, China, and the then Soviet Union. India was a neutral nations repatriation commission member and has helped in terms of the repatriation of the refugees and prisoners of war during that part of the time, that part of the history. South Korea is a member of the United Nations since 1991, and there is a lot of coordination between South Korea and India in this regard in various formats, multilateral formats. There is a lot of internal churning out process that is happening in South Korea since the 1960s with the Samyeol-Yuntung creating surpluses in agriculture, which is now increasingly used for the industrialization and the takeoff period by the 70s and 80s. So that pitches South Korea into a major global economy in the subsequent period. However, the geopolitics of East Asia has impacted on South Korea subsequently. So let me look at some of the commonalities and others in the India-South Korea relations, the context. Both India and South Korea face the common challenges, security challenges and economic and other challenges. Primarily, it also faces the North Korean nuclear factor, while India faces the Pakistani nuclear expansion, both in its fissile material as well as in ballistic missile materials. So this is a common challenge in terms of the WMD proliferation, weapons of mass destruction proliferation. There is also the South Korean concern on the subversion that comes across the Han River, as well as through various other activities by the North Korean commandos and others. India also faces a similar problem of cross-border terrorism. And so there is a certain commonality that South Korea and India can work together on counter-terrorism measures, which is promoted by the 1267 Committee of the United Nations, which looks at, of course, the ISIL and the Al-Qaeda Committee. The third area where India and South Korea can also come together is in the energy resources, in the non-renewables, renewables and other forms of energy. For example, there is the South Korean offer to promote nuclear energy in India as the South Korean side makes major inroads in the technological prowess of the nuclear cycle. So that is an area where we are looking at the India-South Korea coordination and cooperation. This is an opportunity for the two countries. Second is in the environmental issues on the renewables that they focus on in energy. And this is also an upcoming area of cooperation. Third is migration. Both India and South Korea face a similar problem. India today has several millions of people coming from the neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Tibet. In these areas, we see a lot of migration. Likewise, South Korea also faces the threat of migration if there is the political disturbances in North Korea. And of course, we have seen nearly 1 million families divided across the 38th parallel. That creates a lot of scope for migration in the near future, depending on the political situation in North Korea. A fourth area of non-traditional security issue is the gun running, smuggling, and drugs in the vicinity through the smugglers and other gangs. India also faces similar problems as it is closer to the Myanmar borders, as well as Afghanistan-related drug trafficking incidents. Finally, in terms of the context between India and China, both see a lot of opportunities, as Ambassador Bhagat mentioned, and also Dr. Trivedi mentioned about the opportunities, such as in democracy. How do we intensify the democratic experiment between our two societies? How do we learn from each other in terms of political participation, in terms of the institutions at various levels? How do we learn from each other? We see a lot of stable democratic institutions in South Korea, and anti-corruption is one of the major contributions in South Korea. This is where India also is very much interested in. Stability, how to maintain prosperity as well. How do we marry democracy with economic growth rates? India values this kind of an equation as India is developing. How do we prosper, yet at the same time remain democratic? This is also an area that we are trying to pursue through the CEPA, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, as well as in several multilateral security fora and economic fora in the recent times. Let me also quickly go ahead with some of the problems that India has faced in the neighborhood. As I mentioned before, India was part of the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission in the 1950 and helped settle the POW issue, which was the main issue during the 1950s. There was the 60th Indian Field Ambulance Unit that provided medical assistance during the Korean War. I think we need to remember this because of the kind of humanitarian assistance that was provided at that point of time. But we also have the problem, as I mentioned before, of the nuclear proliferation. Abdul Qadir Khan, the father of the Pakistani nuclear bomb, mentioned in 2004 about the Pakistan-North Korea WMD transfers. For example, Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, when she visited Pyongyang, and there was the transit through Beijing and other places, there were a lot of reports, declassified reports about North Korea supplying the Nodong missile system to Pakistan in lieu of Pakistan providing fissile material and other nuclear materials to North Korea. As a result of this, North Korea today has tested its nuclear weapons in the last few years about 6 times and has enhanced also its ballistic missile capabilities and outreach. And so this is a factor which South Korea and India need to come together in terms of the restrictions imposed by the Security Council, such as 1718 resolution on the nuclear test, and also how do we monitor the current situation between India, Pakistan, South Korea, North Korea, and what do we learn from this and cooperate. Also, as the Indian Ocean diplomacy becomes much more agile, there is the South Korea-India cooperation in the maritime domain. That is a project that we need to focus on, basically including in the Coast Guard cooperation on WMD proliferation issues or on the CSI, PSI related matters. We have had a number of visits between India and South Korea. I want to skip this slide, but just to emphasize, we began a security dialogue mechanism in 2005, a counter-terrorism cooperation in 2003, and also logistics supplies, and the Korean Defense Acquisition Program Administration and the DRDO in India are discussing issues related to various aspects of reducing the costs in the defense-related cooperation, because these are capital-intensive areas, and that is an area where India and South Korea are expanding. There are several MOUs signed, and many areas are now being explored in the marine systems, electronics, intelligence systems, and so on and so forth. They both also are contemplating intensifying the military exercises. So finally, let me say that the strategic autonomy and the geopolitical context within which they operate, India and South Korea still find a lot of opportunities. I mentioned about Act East policy and the Korean New Southbound policy, these Southern policy, these result in a huge opportunity for both countries. Let me identify the 6 areas broadly here. Joint counter-terrorism exercises that need to be explored and intensified, as both face similar problems in terrorism-related aspects. And so in terms of surveillance technologies, in terms of counter-terrorism exercises, this is a priority that we need to keep in mind as an opportunity between 2 countries. Second is the energy crisis that erupted with Ukraine, where the price of oil today has gone beyond $100 per barrel. and it is touching the lives of everybody on the planet, and in a negative manner. And so this is a time for us to explore renewable sources of energy, including solar, where India is crafting the International Solar Alliance, and also emphasizing on the wind energy, nuclear energy, and other areas. So this is an area I think we need to explore further so that we mitigate challenges constantly coming with the outbreak of the Ukrainian conflict. The third area is at Naro in southern part of South Korea. South Korea has been launching space missions. However, the contacts between ISRO, Indian Space Research Organization, as well as the South Korean Space Agency, that needs to be intensified since the KITSAT program has been launched by South Korea in 1999. Also, South Korea had deployed the THAAD system, Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, with the cooperation of the United States. United States and India are also discussing the BMD, TMD system. And this is where I think in terms of the ancillary technologies and others, in terms of less capital expenditure, Korea and India need to explore these dual use technologies for their own security. And there is the proposal from South Korea for supply of the Golden Eagle trainer, possibly for the Indian Air Force in the future. There is a huge demand within the Indian armed forces in this regard. Let me shift to the maritime areas, where the sea lanes of communications protection is another area of cooperation as the geopolitical changes are intensifying in this part of the world in the maritime domain. As you know, that in 2016, there was the Permanent Court of Arbitration insisting on the rule of law and the freedom of navigation in South China Sea and other areas. And this is where South Korea has expressed interest in the Indo-Pacific and the Quad Plus initiatives that US, Japan, Australia, India have cobbled up, and 4 meetings took place in the last 1.5 years. So there is a lot of coordination expected between South Korea and India in the maritime domain. But intensely, India is looking at the security of the ports, in which South Korea has been one of the major actors. India is also looking at coastal areas for development, civil and economy development. Also in this area, South Korea has become one of the major leaders across the globe in terms of logistics and others. And finally, in terms of the containers, technology and so on, India and South Korea have signed several agreements on minesweepers. Already South Korea has been supplying these minesweepers to India, but there is also the capacity buildup that India is looking at. And this is where a number of MOUs could be signed between South Korea and India. There is the fifth area of cooperation on counter-piracy, not just in Indian Ocean region, but increasingly as the piracy incidents affect the Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesian waters in South China Sea, South Korean Navy and the Indian Navy or the Coast Guards need to intensify discussions related to counter-piracy operations. This is an area which would affect their commerce as South Korea and India are expanding their civilian commerce. Piracy incidents would affect these slots, and so the counter-piracy operations need to be looked at by South Korea and India. The maritime agencies need to, and finally, as the global commons come under stress, both in space as well as in cyber domain and the space areas, maritime areas, counter cyber attacks cooperation that needs to be intensified. We know that the South Korean ATMs came under attack from North Korea. There are also several other incidents of cyber attacks. Likewise, in India, last 2 years ago, in Maharashtra, the thermal power stations went blank when cyber attacks took place. And that was a double whammy because many patients who were affected by the COVID-19 virus were in the ICUs, intensive care units, and many of them were affected with the breakdown in the power sector. And so the cyber attacks today can affect the economies, the various other social sectors, and this is where we need to also cooperate. As Samsung and other companies are intensifying their cooperation with Indian counterparts, this is also an area that we need to look at more carefully on the cyber attacks. So let me summarize by saying that while South Korea and India aspire to maintain their strategic autonomy, there are several geopolitical challenges that stare at them, mainly in the outbreak of the Russian invasion of Ukraine recently, in terms of food security, energy security, supply chain disruption, and various other challenges. We also saw technology disruptions that are happening in the recent times. This is an area where South Korea and India need to come together and see these as opportunities for cooperation that they can work through. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kondapalli, for such a brilliant lecture and also for such a comprehensive and giving a detailed outlook on the geopolitical realities in the region and the opportunities for India and Republic of Korea. Very aptly, you have summarized the evolution of strategic autonomy debate in both the countries, and you have also outlined the common challenges, be it the weapons of mass destruction in the Korean Peninsula or the challenge of terrorism that India faces. And also, you have also focused on some of the commonalities and areas of cooperation, such as in sectors such as energy, renewables, wind and solar, and cooperation in the field of environment, security. Along with that, you've also focused on cooperation in the areas of space technology, sea line of communications, how to cooperate in the areas of like ports, coastal areas, containers, counter piracy operation, and cyber attacks. So these are certainly, I would agree, and I'm sure the participants would also agree that these are some of the common challenges. And in fact, both not only countries like India and Korea, but other countries in the region are also facing similar challenges. And we need to come together to come up and for facing these challenges. Professor, now we open the floor for discussion, and I invite questions from the participants. Meanwhile, I request all the participants to be ready. But before that, I would like to give the floor to Professor Soon-Chun Lee, who is Professor of Economics at Busan University of Foreign Studies, and he is also the Honorary Director of India Center at Busan. Professor Soon-Chun Lee, over to you now.
Professor Srikanth Kondapalli. It's a really good presentation, and it's a very good things to make the cooperation between the two countries. I really agree with your presentations and your suggestions. Then I like the nuclears and the terrorism exercise space, the launches, and some cyber attacks. But geographically, we have so many big countries around our country, like the China, the Japan, Russia, and even USA, So you have faced the security problem to make the cooperation and and particularly these days we have the conflict between the US and China, and also we have the lack of the recovery of the relations with Japan, and we have also Ukraine war and inter-Korea problem. I mean the North Korea problems. Those affected Korea the security very much there geographically. So with this point, I think we need to make the cooperation with India in the East area, East Asia. What do you think India can place in peace on Korea Peninsula? For example, India maybe can play the role as an intermediary in the restoring relation with Japan. We don't have any relation improvement with the Japan lately. We don't have any visiting the higher level persons. So we have we need some solutions. And also in East Asia, India is I think India is can be an important cooperative partner for the Korea. Now I ask you, what is your opinion in the India's roles in East Asia for make the cooperation with Korea?
Can I reply, Dr.
Yes.
Trivedi? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. That's a good question. Well, I began with the discussion related to the Korean War and how India was a mediator during this time, and also for the settlement of the prisoners of war. So India had a huge role at that point of time. 4 nations, Bulgaria, Switzerland, and India, and one more country, Poland, I guess. They have been neutral between the warring, partners, parties, and that is where India had signaled how they can craft an independent strategic autonomous policy. And of course, the 1962 war between China and India had cut off that link between China and East Asia, as China has increased its power. And today there is the rise of China that is also creating a lot of ripples. For example, the Chinese have been saying a lot of negative comments on the Quad and the Indo-Pacific, which has become a necessity recently after the South China Sea militarization and the disruption that is quite possible in the South China Sea lanes of communications. So in this background, India had intensified the Act East policy from Look East policy. So not just look east, but also act. So that was the main thrust. And Act East policy resulted in, number one, intensifying the economic linkage, intensifying the maritime linkage, intensifying the commercial and the challenges in the maritime domain, that is piracy and so on. And finally, there is also the diplomatic and military cooperation, especially in terms of joint naval exercises that India today is conducting with most countries in East Asia, including, of course, with China. We have the Coast Guard and the Navy-related search and rescue operations with China. And as I mentioned, there is the maritime and naval cooperation with South Korea already in place. I mentioned about the minesweepers that South Korea is today supplying to India. And we have many other programs in this domain. in the naval domain. So there is this Act East policy that was announced since 2015. In the economic aspects, while trade between India and Korea, India and Japan, India, China, India and Taiwan, India and Australia, other countries are increasing recently. We've also now been discussing about the larger economic architecture. So India did not join the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, because we think that China is dominating the RCEP, and we think that China is misusing the origins of the goods and investments because they can start a factory in Laos or Cambodia and still keep dumping goods in the rest of the world and in India. So with this, India did not join the RCEP, in which South Korea is a partner, but India has concerns on the RCEP. We are comfortable with the bilateral FTAs that we signed with South Korea in the CEPA format, as well as with Japan, and the ASEAN free trade area that we signed with the 10 Southeast Asian countries. So because of the concerns on China, both at the economic and the military level, security level, the Indian side has bifurcated and intensifying its relations with the other East Asian partners. Let me also say that 1.5 years ago, on June 15th, 2020, China killed 20 Indian soldiers, and this has become a major issue in India-China relations. Before that, we thought that the agreements we signed with China will be respected by China. However, China threw these agreements to the wind, and they began using coercive diplomatic postures or even outright killing of the Indian soldiers in the Ladakh region of the western sector of the India-China border. So with this, there is a frosty relationship between India and China currently, and this is also reflected in India and East Asia cooperation intensifying. We have structured dialogues with South Korea and Japan. We're also opening up to Taiwan in the semiconductor industry and in other areas of economy and investments areas. So that is the nature of the interaction right now we are having.
Thank you, Professor Kondapalli, for your response. Before I see one hand raised, but before I give the floor to Ms. Sanskriti, I have a question. This is from your presentation. As you had mentioned that one of the, while outlining the strategic autonomy objectives of India, you highlighted that promoting democracy abroad is one of the key characteristics which Indian foreign policy is focusing upon. So in this context, if you could just elaborate on the response of our government in the context of the changes that we are witnessing in our neighborhood, especially countries like Myanmar or Sri Lanka, like the changes that are happening, if you could elaborate on this.
That's a good question. In terms of promoting democracy, India has been, as I mentioned before, first addressing the United Nations bodies where there is a democracy fund. Indian contribution today is higher than many democratic countries, including the United States, in the funding of the democracy program. So this is at the global level. At the regional level, there is an intensification of NGOs, civil society, and others' interactions with the neighborhood. India's focus initially has been to restore democracy in Nepal, in Bhutan, and see to it that the democracy rooted in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and other areas are becoming more mature. So initially, India focused on Southern Asia, and today it is now interacting with the other countries in the region. So this is where Myanmar comes up, and this is where the other Southeast Asian countries or others follow up. And of course, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan are mature democracies. And India is also sending a lot of parliamentary delegations in order to look at how do we intensify the democratic aspects here, specifically focusing on how do we deliver goods to the people, even while initiating economic reforms, as well as the participation of people in the decision-making process. So number one is the parliamentary delegations, which have increased in their intensity. Of course, because of COVID-19 and social distancing, last 2.5 years has been a major setback for this process of physical movement of people from one area to the other. So that is how we have had the virtual meetings like that we are having now. So there is an effort here to also have a dialogue with the decision makers, especially at the parliamentary level. Number two is how do we learn from restructuring, reorganizing the voting system or electoral malpractices that exist in many democracies. And so this is also an area we are discussing when the NGOs, when the various other parliamentary delegations are visiting each other. So this is a second subject that we come across. The third is democracies are transparent and open, and that feeds into the democratic experiment as such. And so one of the institutions here is the media. So we have several MOUs between South Korean and Indian media. Also, this is partly triggered by the economic and trade increase between the two countries. So there has been an effort here for example, in many Indian households, we can see Arirang TV. And this is an effort for communication to learn from each other's societies. And I hear that several soap operas of Indian TV are also quite popular in the South Korean society. So this is also another area, but more seriously, in terms of the newspapers, the print media and electronic media, there is more to do in this sphere, but the good news is that there are some MOUs signed, and we are looking for intensifying the interactions between the media personnel in order to increase transparency, which is what democracies stand for. And then there are also the, for example, India is famous for implementing the electronic voting machines. India today is donating these to Afghanistan, to Nepal, to various other countries. And hence, this is an area where we can learn from. Do you know that we have nearly 800 million people who are eligible for voting in India, and 60 to 70% of them vote? That's about roughly 600 million people vote in Indian elections, and many of them are just below 20 years, majority of them, because average age of India today is 26 years. So many of these voters in India are younger people, and they are expressing their views recently in terms of changing political fortunes. And so the democratic experiment in India, as it intensifies through these modern systems like EVMs, electronic voting machines or other digital display mechanisms. Here is a IT giant like South Korea can pitch in both at the domestic level as well as for promoting democracy abroad as well. And so this is an area, I think there is a huge prospect in both India and South Korea in promoting democracy.
Since we have already exceeded an hour, we can, Professor, if you allow, we can just take a couple of questions. We have 2 raised hands, and maybe we can take them together and then you respond to both of them. Could we have Ms. Namrata Mandaloi on the screen?
Thank you so much, sir, for a very informative session. And the session was highlighting very important aspects of both India and ROK. My question is, what are the strategic advantages we as country have over other neighboring countries when we are talking about our economic growth, and also when we are talking about securing our borders in all the 3 areas? Thank you.
The areas of areas that India could, it has an advantage on. And you mentioned economy and the border areas as well. How does India, enhance its power, enhance its influence? Number one, the advantages that India has at the moment, as I mentioned, average age of India is 26 years. I may be older than this, but the audience here would suggest to average Indian age as roughly about 20 odd years, 26 in the whole country. What it means is that there is a younger population profile leading to the rise of India. So this is a very big advantage. If you look at the countries which had risen, it is mainly based on the younger population profile. So we should be expecting India's rise as a part of this younger population profile. The second advantage that India has is the 400 million middle class. It is estimated between 400 to 500 million. That's quite a huge, when you compare the transatlantic relations, when you look at the East Asian profile, you don't find these many combined together even, 400 to 500 million middle class. That is, these are the ones who are going to drive the domestic consumption. Economy, several countries have sustained their economies because they have been able to have huge domestic consumption. India today consumes nearly 59% of what it produces, or what it, as a gross national product, which includes imports and everything else. So India today has this advantage that its growth rates are going to be certain. Of course, we had the COVID-19 supply chain disruption. We also had a negative growth rate in 2020, but that is because everybody, all of us were sitting at home in order to cope up with the COVID challenges, and hence there is the decline in economy. But that is extraordinary, once in a century kind of a disaster that is problematic for every other country. So the overall situation is that India's growth rates are relatively sustainable because Indians consume a lot of consumer durables and products, which means that we don't see possibly any structural problems except during COVID-19. So this means that this is a huge asset for any political leadership. 400 million middle class suggests that you can keep consuming and you can keep producing through the younger population profile, and that is where this advantage manifests. When you look at other countries, for example, entire East Asian countries are aging. More pensioners are joining the society. And also, of course, the consumption pattern is very high. Nevertheless, due to the Gini coefficient inequalities in income between rural and urban areas, specifically in Japan, South Korea, and China, there has been a problem in maintaining economic growth rates. I'm speaking in relative terms, which means that specifically in case of China, the Gini coefficient is alarmingly very high, and the aging of the population is also quite rapid, which means then, and their domestic consumption is no more than 40% of their GDP, unlike in the Indian case of nearly 55, 59, somewhere in between. So this suggests that India has this advantage in the having the middle class growing. And so that is another. Third is, of course, many Indians have learned the English language. This is an advantage that many have in globalization period. Of course, North Korea, Japan, South Korea, North Korea never joined globalization, but South Korea intensively. South Korea also has an advantage in terms of the globalization and other aspects. In the recruitment patterns in universities abroad, South Korean students are one of the major foreign students abroad. So that also is an advantage. Nevertheless, there is a structural advantage for India in terms of this growing middle class and growing younger population profile, which is transited into the English-speaking fraternity in India. The fourth area is we have a stock exchange, which is 150, 160 years old, Mumbai Stock Exchange. And while KOSPI, while Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Hang Seng in Hong Kong, and the Japanese Stock Exchange did witness turbulence, we saw Mumbai Stock Exchange going up and up in the recent times. The FIIs, financial institutional investors, there is a slight dip in 2-3 months of this year, but nevertheless, we have seen an upsurge in the investments in the stock exchanges. So Mumbai Stock Exchange is quite bullish recently, and this is reflected across the board stocks, both in goods and services sector, as well as in the IT, NASCOM, and other areas. A fifth advantage that India has is in the growth rates that we have seen recently. Sustainable growth rates, there is the basic fundamental. For example, India is one of the largest FDI attracting countries in the last decade, nearly a decade. Despite COVID, India is still the third largest FDI destination in the world. And this is facilitated by India jumping up the rank of ease of doing business. 3 times that India had jumped up the scale, and today the various companies across the globe are making a beeline, and this is an area where we see a lot of progress in terms of the businesses, FDI, technology transfers, and other. So this is also one more area of advantage for India. Your second aspect of the question had a border related. How does India manage? Well, there are a lot of border management measures that India had undertaken with confidence building measures, CBMs. there is a Director General of Military Operations meeting between India and Pakistan on nuclear issues. There is also the CBMs in the conventional field with China that has failed because China had changed its policy. But with that change in policy, the credibility of China has gone down because they signed these agreements and they violated these agreements in 2020. So this is an area where India is facing a problem right now in border management. But with Bangladesh, with Nepal, with Bhutan, with Myanmar, and with Sri Lanka in the maritime domain, we have very stiff border management protocols. And this is an area where India is working across on the border related issues.
There is a question in the chat box. If you permit, should we take that? Yeah, this question is directly related to China, and Ms. Sanskriti Sinha, she writes, since the pandemic year, China is not in a good bilateral relationship with its neighboring countries. So how it's going to affect China in the future?
Yes, this question has a domestic dimension and an external dimension. Domestic dimension is President Xi Jinping changed the policies of China from Tao Kuang Yang Hui, which is roughly translated as keeping a low profile, that Deng Xiaoping introduced in the 1980s. So Xi Jinping changed this Tao Kuang Yang Hui to Yoso Zhou Wei. Yoso Zhou Wei or Fan Fa Yo Wei, these two suggest that they think that they have come of age. They think that they have to assert themselves. So while they became more aggressive in the neighborhood, they became also very assertive at the domestic level. So that is the reason why we see the zero COVID policy of restrictions. There is a huge quarantine, control over the borders, no flights, no aviation, no shipping, with which, of course, many South Korean students have suffered in the last 2.5 years. Although they paid their tuition fees, nevertheless, the Chinese have not been able to comply with the agreements they signed with these universities in South Korea. As with India, 30,000 Indian students could not go to China because of this zero COVID policy. And many of them lost their medical degrees because for 2.5 years, you can't teach medical education through the Zoom or Cisco WebEx. There should be practicals, and China banned all the exit entry routes. So that resulted in a lot of hardship for many students from the neighboring countries. So the domestic policies of Xi Jinping with this Fan Fa Yo Wei, as well as the other policies that were implemented, created a lot of problems for the domestic audience and also to the neighboring countries. So this is where we see the South China Sea dispute intensifying with Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and increasingly also with Natuna gas fields with Indonesia. With Vietnam and Philippines, that became more violent. In 2014, China had drowned 21 Vietnamese boats in the Paracels Islands. So the Vietnamese also demonstrated against the Chinese, and they killed 5 Chinese in South Vietnam in these anti-China riots. Likewise, with Philippines, China's assertiveness in South China Sea resulted in a lot of problem in the bilateral level and in the Scarborough Shoal. The second area is with the Taiwan Straits. Previously, they followed a lot of policies to subjugate Taiwan, but none of these succeeded. So they tried an economic angle that is increasing investments and trade and people-to-people contacts. But this has failed in the last few years as China went away from its ECFA, Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, and started putting restrictions on the trade, investments, and people-to-people contact. As it happened with South Korea on the Jeju Island, where the Chinese tourists were banned when South Korea deployed the THAAD system, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, and the Lotte Group shares have fallen, with the Chinese demonstrating on the Lotte Group companies, supermarkets in China. So China also weaponized the tourism, trade, investments, also with the neighboring countries. This has also happened with the Japanese on the Senkaku Islands and with Australia, when Australia took the lead in questioning China on the Wuhan origins of the COVID-19. So in this background, we see Xi Jinping had shifted from Tao Kuan Yang Hui to Fan Fa Yo Wei, and that resulted in a lot of tension with the neighborhood. So your question can be explained at the domestic level of China and the external level. Domestically, there are a number of protests that are increasing in China as the Gini coefficient and the decline in economy in China has resulted in. And so this is an area where both domestic and externals are impacted with the recent policies in the last decade. If Xi Jinping is nominated for a third term on October 16th this year at the 20th Party Congress, it is likely to see more such tensions unless until he reverses the Fan Fa Yo Wei strategy that he implemented in the last 5-6 years.
Well, it's been now almost 1.5 hours. So let us now wrap up the discussion and give a great round of applause to our most valued speaker, Professor Kondapalli, and to all the live participants, faculty members, researchers, and all the students from Busan University of Foreign Studies, and also students who are joining from other universities in Korea and India, and also from other parts of the world. Also officials and representatives from different institutions in Korea, and all invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Embassy of India and the Indian Cultural Center, it is an honor and privilege for me to propose the vote of thanks for today. Special thanks to the team of the Embassy and the Indian Cultural Center, and also the India Center at Busan for their enormous support and coordination in putting up this workshop together for the audiences abroad, always willing to know more about India in its diverse manifestations. Special thanks to Professor Sun Chun Lee for being our partner and coordinating this workshop from Busan, and also hosting the first workshop, the inaugural lecture by Sriram Madhav there. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our hearty thanks to all the participants for their presence in large numbers today. And once again, to Professor Kondapalli for such a detailed and very comprehensive presentation, and also being so generous with the time and responding to each and every questions. Thank you, sir. I'm sure this academic endeavor and your lecture on strategic autonomy and geopolitics, opportunities for India and Republic of Korea would have been insightful and a learning experience for all the participants who are present here today. Finally, a big thanks once again to all those who are present, in particular, and to the people of Korea in general, who have been so open and receptive to the cultures all across the world, and also we've been participating in all our activities, be it academic, all cultural activities. Hope to see you all for tomorrow's session, which is focused on global media and politics, narratives from India and Republic of Korea. The lecture will be by Professor K.G. Suresh, who is Vice Chancellor of Makhanlal Chaturvedi National University of Journalism and Communication at Bhopal. Till then, friends, stay tuned to our social media handles for more updates about our future events. Dhanyavad, Kamsahamnida.